Today, LSD and most hallucinogens are illegal. For decades, millions in the West believed acid and similar drugs could unlock the doors of perception. Then, as one door opened, another closed.
Hallucinogenic plants seem to have always been an important part of human society, going way back to primitive cultures.
How did we go from having the most revered substances of the shamanic world become the most reviled of the modern?
This is a story of the discovery of peyote, magic mushrooms, and beyond. One man's little-known quest to classify the plants of the gods. Before hallucinogens were well known, real-life Indiana Jones, Richard Evans Schultes, searched the Americas for these mind-altering substances. He revolutionized science and spawned another revolution he never imagined. In 1939, with World War II underway in Europe, Richard Evans Schultes' pioneering work on a hallucinogenic cactus and a magic mushroom did little to catapult him into stardom. What the war did promise were thousands of wounded soldiers, and they would need surgery. Medical science was on the hunt for ways of improving surgical anesthesia. In 1941, Schultes received a grant from the U.S. National Research Council. His assignment? Travel to South America to identify the botanical source of curare poison. He entered the land of the Kofan Indians, the most notorious poison makers in the Northwest Amazon. Here, among the Kofan, he also came upon the most powerful hallucinogen found in nature. I've come thousands of miles south to the Ecuadorian Amazon to continue my journey retracing my professor's explorations as he pursued the secrets of the Amazonian vision vine. "60 years ago, this territory was untouched forest. Today, I've got to pass through this seedy Ecuadorian border town, perched on the dangerous Colombian frontier, to reach the descendants of the Kofan Indians that Schultes met. I first came here in the mid-70s, and it's changed a lot.
Well, the amazing thing is that this entire place has grown up since oil was discovered. And even in 1974, it was one single mud strip, a couple of hotels, a couple of whorehouses, and you know, it happened to sit on top of the biggest pool of oil ever discovered in Ecuador, probably in South America. And the Kofan just had the misfortune to be the owners of that land under which oil was found.
From this landing, I've got a 9-hour river trip ahead of me to get to the Kofan Indian village. You know, when Schultes finished his work in Mexico, he had 2 job offers after he got his PhD. He could have gone and become a school teacher at a private school in New England, or he could have gone to the Amazon to search for the mystery of a plant known as the flying death. Fortunately for science, he chose the Amazon. To reach the Kofan, Schultes traveled for weeks, first through Colombia on foot, over the Andes, and then by boat, down one river, then up the Sucumbíos River into the land of the poison makers. In the 16th century, explorers like Sir Walter Raleigh were amazed by the blowgun. Darts dipped in plant poisons that could kill silently from a distance. Terrified Europeans dubbed it the Flying Death. Raleigh described its horrifying consequences. Victims of the poison suffer an ugly and lamentable death, sometimes dying stark mad. The poison was curare, a mixture of plants. Since its discovery by the Spanish in the 16th century, scientists have been fascinated by its paralyzing properties and its medical potential. Small samples would find their way out of the jungle, but no one knew their source.
Then, in the 1930s, scientists discovered that curare was a powerful muscle relaxant that had the promise of transforming modern surgery. Schulte's hunt began in 1941. Other explorers who had entered this region of the Amazon had returned with lurid and fantastic tales of terrible diseases and even cannibals. It was one of the last unknown places on the planet. The area Schultes explored was the size of Western Europe. Months passed with no contact with the outside world. He survived treacherous rapids, encounters with wild animals, near fatal plane crashes, and suffered from any number of tropical diseases. He traveled light, with a single change of clothes, a pith helmet, a hammock, a camera, plant collecting gear, snakebite serum, a machete, and his beloved LL Bean moccasins. He never carried a gun. He was the first outsider some tribes had ever seen. "I do not believe in hostile Indians," Schultes once wrote. "All that is required to bring out their gentlemanliness is reciprocal gentlemanliness."
Schultes is the big figure of the 20th century, an inspiration to outside of ethnobotany, to anthropologists. You know, he went and took the Indians seriously in the 1940s and 50s and listened to them and swallowed their plants when they said he should and learned from them. And in a world of racism and prejudice where everybody thought Indians were a bunch of losers and Stone Age obstacles to progress, he realized that they were a path to knowledge.
When I was doing my researches in Colombia in the 1970s, I was told by a Colombian botanist that if I ever had difficulties out in the jungle or anywhere, that if I just mentioned Schultes' name and said I was associated with him, he said it would just open doors. He said, down here, Schultes es Dios, Schultes is God.
"9 hours downriver from the end of the road, we're approaching the Kofan village, the same tribe Schultes visited in 1941. I'm dropping in on an old friend, Randy Borman. Randy's parents were missionaries, and he was raised from birth in the forest and grew up as a Kofan, speaking the language and learning the ways of the elders."
You know, it's incredible. When Schultes came, you got a sense that it was a very remote place, you know. Incredible.
Randy and I are tracking down some of the same magical plants that Schultes sought. Those discoveries would lead him to a new kind of hallucinogen, the most powerful found in nature. In 1942, ethnobotanist Richard Evans Schultes, working for the U.S. National Research Council, came to the Amazon to seek the botanical sources of curare. It was believed that this poison could be used as an effective supplement to modern anesthesia. Today, my friend Randy Borman is taking me to a part of the forest where the Kofan still gather the plants that yield the toxin.
The actual compounds are created by the plants in order to protect themselves from predation in this kind of orgy of life that is the Amazon rainforest. So D tuberculare, from an evolutionary point of view, was created by the plant to protect itself from insect predation. And of course, that's what the indigenous people have been exploiting for so many thousands of years.
Blowguns, 8 feet in length, combined with poison-tipped darts, are used to take down animals as small as a hummingbird or as big as a tapir. Occasionally, they've proven deadly on humans during times of tribal wars.
This is condodendron, which is the main ingredient of the arrow poison. I mean, this is condodendron tomentosum, ¿no es cierto? And this is the classic flying death. This is the arrow poison, the foundation of all the major arrow poisons in the northwest Amazon.
Getting the liana takes work. These vines grow more than 40 feet from the forest floor.
You can chew on the bark of curare without it doing any damage. It's incredibly bitter, but obviously it's not going to kill you because it hasn't been concentrated. I mean, that's the whole thing about these plants that we're seeing in the forest. The Indian people have learned to find ways to concentrate the poison inside this bark to a level of intensity that actually allows you to kill.
Richard Evans Schultes discovered that the Kofan were sophisticated pharmacists, manipulating and combining plants with incredible dexterity and genius. His discoveries of more than a dozen curare ingredients added to the knowledge of the toxin, soon to be a standard addition to modern surgical anesthesia.
All of these different admixtures that are put into it are what made the Kofan poison especially potent. Now, there's at least 15 different separate species that form part of the Kofan curare, the Kofan blowgun poison. And the Kofan blowgun poison was then known throughout the whole region as the superior concoction.
From the point of view of the Kofan, you go out into this extraordinary forest, you find all these different toxic plants, and you learn to combine them in ways that create powerful effects. It's just such an extraordinary level of genius. It's just unparalleled.
Curare was just the beginning. The Kofan used plants to stun fish, heal the sick, and above all, alter perception. Their sacred hallucinogen, ayahuasca, or yahe, was a potion so sophisticated in its preparation that it would astonish the scientific world. First reported in 1851 by Schultes' great hero, the legendary plant explorer Richard Spruce, the exact ingredients and the ritual remained a mystery. Schultes learned that for the Kofan, yahe has always been a path to discovery.
In the sense that the Western world uses, they're not hallucinogens or stimulants or any of these other things. For instance, for a Kofan, it's no surprise whatsoever when they look through a microscope and all of a sudden find a complete new world down there on the microscope slide. Because they knew it all the time. They knew that there were all these dimensions, all sorts of things that you can't see around you. The microscope is seen very much in the same way as yahe is seen. It's a means to be able to get to where you can see what's going on down there.
What Schultes found was extraordinary. A hallucinogen that seemed to tap into the very synapses of the brain, made possible by the Kofan's uncanny knowledge of plant chemistry. On the verge of unraveling the mysteries of ayahuasca and the ways of the shaman, Schultes' life was catapulted in a totally different direction. In 1942, war raged in the Pacific, and the Japanese swept across Southeast Asia, taking control of 95% of the world's domestic rubber supply. The Allies desperately needed alternative sources, and the best place to go was the Amazon, where the rubber tree was native. Richard Evans Schultes was called back to Washington, D.C. At a meeting at the Department of Agriculture in November of 1942, he learned that supplies of natural rubber, essential for jeeps, tanks, ships, and planes, were dangerously low. There were no synthetic sources, and the war demanded that America alone produce 1 million metric tons of rubber every year. President Roosevelt ordered U.S. scientists to begin scouring the Americas for supplies of any and all latex-bearing plants. Schultes' new Amazon assignment? Help save the country by finding new sources of latex and blight-free, fast-growing rubber trees. his work on ayahuasca, the sacred hallucinogen, would have to wait. Randy and the Kofan are leading me to a place in the forest where ayahuasca can be found.
You take it in your mouth, it tastes a little bitter, but so many other plants of the forest do. And so what were the clues? What allowed them to know, however many hundreds or even thousands of years ago, that you could take this, woody vine of the forest, combine it with this shrub, which is just, again, doesn't look like anything out of the ordinary. And yet inside the plants are these remarkable chemicals that, when combined in this unique way, create a kind of powerful synergistic effect, almost like a sense of the biochemical version of the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And it's really one of the great mysteries of all of ethnobotany, of all of the science of plants in the Amazon. We know, of course, how the chemicals interact. What we don't know is how the people first made this extraordinary discovery.
Schultes collected thousands of plants from the Amazon. Like ayahuasca, many were used by shamans to cure illness.
Shamanism is natural product chemistry. Shamans are not priests. They're scientists or natural philosophers in the original sense of the term. And they were always looking for the active principles of plants and trying to get concentrated activity.
I do think that there are many things that shamans do that could be very useful for doctors in our society to do. I think shamans are really masters of the psychological realm and the whole area of what I'd call the art of medicine, of like knowing how to take a patient's projection of belief onto you and reflect it back in a way that increases the possibility of healing.
So this is the other admixture, or the other plant that's added to the preparation. Remembering always that ayahuasca is not a plant, it's a combination of plants. This is known scientifically as Psychotria viridis. It's in the coffee family. You can tell by the opposite leaves, and if you look at the little fruit, it looks a little bit like a coffee bean. And yet again, you look in the forest, would this stand out as any other plant? Not particularly. What happens if you eat it, A little bitter, but no more so than this one. And nothing that you would say that, if you just took this, that you would somehow know that this had some real magic within it. I could eat as many of these leaves as I could get off this branch, and nothing would happen to me. Because the chemical that's found within this is denatured by an enzyme found naturally in the human stomach.
But combine the leaves with this vine, and you neutralize the stomach enzyme. It's this combination that produces the astonishing hallucinogenic effects. Chemicals found in ayahuasca resemble those used in modern antidepressants such as Prozac. And they've been tested in clinical trials to treat Parkinson's disease. They may have other properties still not fully understood by science. But it was tales of the wild visions that brought beat writer William Burroughs, who had studied anthropology at Harvard, down to Colombia in 1953 in search of ayahuasca. When he went to his first jungle town, he got rolled, robbed, beaten up, and jailed. The writer, most famous for counterculture books like The Naked Lunch, decided he'd better look up Richard Evans Schultes in Bogota to help him find a safer route to the sacred hallucinogen. When Burroughs finally took ayahuasca, he was terrified.
And when someone like William Burroughs came looking for just another kick and got scared out of his mind, this whole, Yahe is not for the faint-hearted. It's not really supposed to be pleasant. It was never supposed to be a pleasant thing. You're facing down some force.
For those embarking on the ayahuasca experience, there's always a sense of trepidation, of fear. The Kofan speak of facing down the jaguar. One who knew this path was Richard Evans Schultes. In an era before psychedelics, he was the first outsider to walk with the shaman and provide a glimpse into a hidden world known only to these forest peoples. By the end of World War II, in 1945, pressure was off Richard Evans Schultes. But rubber remained of strategic importance, and the U.S. government continued to fund his work in the Amazon. By the 1950s, the seeds of his hallucinogenic discoveries were beginning to sprout, but in ways he never envisioned. In 1953, beat writer William Burroughs wrote his friend, the poet Allen Ginsberg, about his recent expedition with Schultes and the sampling of ayahuasca. Their correspondence was published as the Yahe Letters, and along with his other books, helped forge the framework of the psychedelic era. That same year, a British psychiatrist, Humphrey Osmond, researching schizophrenia, sprinkled some mescaline crystals into the glass of a willing Aldous Huxley, the best-selling author of Brave New World. Huxley documented his fantastic visions in another book, The Doors of Perception. Osmond coined the term psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting. Huxley's book became a manifesto of the era.
I think it would be extremely good for almost anybody with fixed ideas and with a great certainty about what's what, to take this thing and to realize that the world he has constructed is by no means the only world, that there are these extraordinary other types of universe which we may inhabit and which we should be very grateful for inhabiting, I think.
In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, America settled into the staid and comfortable 1950s. But soon, life would be all shook up. First by rock and roll, then by a 39-year-old assistant professor at Harvard.
You'd consider me to be an eccentric.
Suddenly, hallucinogenic drugs slipped out of the hands of jungle shaman and into the minds of the masses.
You didn't have to do that in the 1960s. You didn't have to travel all the way to another continent and trek through the jungle and sit through a ritual for many hours and get sick and vomit to have this experience. You know, it was much easier if down on the street corner somebody you knew at a school or university was selling these tiny little pills that would provide essentially the same kind of experience. That was LSD, of course. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's a level of reality which is invisible to the naked eye, but which has a...
Hoffman's LSD was still legal, so was a mushroom-based psilocybin. Timothy Leary began testing both on Harvard students, following in the footsteps of researcher Humphrey Osmond, who successfully treated alcoholics with hallucinogens in England in the 1950s.
The effect is somewhat like looking through a microscope. Suddenly, when you look through a microscope, you discover that there's an invisible world around you that you hadn't known about before you did it. The same thing is true with a psychedelic drug.
I met Leary in the fall of 1960 and then knew him, and also I was the investigative reporter for the Harvard newspaper that did most of the writing about the, what became the drug scandal at Harvard involving Leary.
Initially, the testing continued at Harvard unopposed, and by 1961, Leary and his colleagues left campus to test the drugs on prison inmate volunteers.
You know, we gave psilocybin to prisoners with the hope that they would get some self-understanding and be able to lower the recidivism rate. Because that was the behavioral index, you see, of consciousness change. Some psychoanalysts would say, well, that's insane. You're going to give this drug to these guys who are murderers and rapists and thugs and whatnot, and you're going to release their unconscious, right? You're taking your life into your hand. It was totally ridiculous. There was never a single moment of violence in the prisons.
Early results looked promising. Fewer inmates seemed to return to prison. But later analysis showed outside factors like counseling had skewed the result. Recidivism hadn't changed. Leary continued to test LSD and psilocybin on student volunteers until 1962, when his methods began to veer from the scientific to the mystical. The study came to an end.
There was contention with the university about whether he could use undergraduates as research subjects. This was a huge story. It eventually became front page news on the New York Times when, when Leary had left Harvard and Alpert was fired. The explosion around that, I think, was really what sent the psychedelic culture into the mainstream in the U.S. And many people, in North America probably, many people had never heard of these.
Leary set up a center for studying LSD and other hallucinogens at Millbrook Mansion, a New York estate donated by the heirs of the Mellon fortune.
Any religious group just beginning.
Tim Leary had a trust in democracy. And he thought that if you popularize these drugs, if you broadcast the message that there were going to be many people who were going to get it, there were going to be a lot of people who didn't get it, who were going to lose their way. He knew that. It was a big social experiment.
LSD didn't reach the street overnight. It had made its own long, strange journey, from the Swiss lab of Albert Hofmann to various English and American psychiatric institutes for testing, and even into the hands of the CIA.
So you had the CIA on the one hand, very, very interested in not just LSD, but a bunch of different hallucinogenic drugs. You had the Beats at the same time experimenting. You had psychiatrists and therapists looking at it, ways to understand mental illness better. All these different elements ended up mixing together and setting the stage for the 1960s.
A far cry from the sacred ways unveiled by Richard Evans Schultes in the Amazon. In the 1960s, Schultes disapproved of the wholesale release of hallucinogens to the public, knowing that most often they would not have a shaman to guide them through the visionary world, with potentially negative results. The shaman blesses the ayahuasca potion to be consumed by the Kofan in the sacred enclosure.
You know, it's amazing to think that these two plants that we found in the forest 8 hours ago have been cooked all day, prepared all day, and will, in the end, launch the Kofan on a kind of journey to this extraordinary realm. You know, one of Schultes' greatest friends was the Colombian anthropologist Geraldo Raicodomatov, and he said that to drink Yahe was to return to the cosmic uterus and be reborn.
The ayahuasca ceremony is both social event and healing ritual. The shaman takes the medicine with the patient in order to enter the realm where he can stalk disease. Ayahuasca is as complex as the human mind. The novice participant, guided by the shaman, travels through a hidden world of sometimes frightening visions. For the apprentice, the potion is used as a tool to move through stages of shamanic power, such as conquering and taking on the spirit of animals. Randy Borman understands his process.
Once you're to the point where you're actually seeing past just the bright colors and the loud sounds, and actually beginning to see the forest people or the animals or whatever like that, then you go to the next stage, which is to actually be able to interact with those. With shamanistic help, you go into the room that has all the jaguar skins in it. If you're able to get to the point where you can actually reach out and grab that with your spirit persona and clothe yourself in that, then you're on your way to becoming a jaguar shaman and actually being able to control the jaguar and actually shape change into the jaguar.
In stark contrast to the traders and adventurers before him, Schultes developed a mutual respect with the Kofan. He took their medicines to better understand the people and their plants. More than anyone else, Schultes brought this hallucinogen to the attention of the outside world. Used today by religious groups in Brazil and America, the full medical potential of ayahuasca remains unknown. Schulte's search for new species of plants took him deeper and deeper into the rainforest. In his first dozen years in the Amazon, Schultes narrowly survived a host of accidents, injuries, and jungle diseases. Then, on a trip up Brazil's Rio Negro, Schultes found himself in the remotest part of the Amazon, on the very edge of death. Throughout the 1950s, Richard Evans Schultes continued his work on developing hardy, blight-resistant strains of rubber trees for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But he never stopped looking for new species of plants, including hallucinogens. Meanwhile, in the United States, by the mid-1960s, Albert Hofmann's LSD genie was well out of its bottle, creating a hallucinogenic revolution that Schultes never endorsed.
Back in the mid-60s, when LSD first came to the fore, people were taking it quietly, individually, for the purposes of introspection. And that is simply not what we were up to. We were taking it in groups, and it was basically a sort of a party situation, but there was, I don't want to say a serious component to it, but there was a forward thrust to it. We were looking to basically to find new levels of communal experience.
Soon, psychedelia was everywhere. Millions of Americans took LSD. And as it grew worldwide, it impacted everything from fashion to the composition of music. Among those who helped LSD go mainstream, the CIA.
It's kind of an interesting phenomenon because every drug that became popular on the street as an illegal substance, a black market substance, in the 1960s and then thereafter, had been previously tested, scrutinized, in some cases even developed by the Central Intelligence Agency and the U.S. military. I'm talking about marijuana, mescaline, LSD, nitrous oxide, cocaine, heroin, magic mushrooms, the whole gamut of so-called recreational drugs. So it's kind of ironic that here you had in the 1950s, the CIA and the Army studying these drugs to develop weapons, and that later on, those same drugs were being embraced not as weapons, but just the opposite, as a form of recreation, or maybe it's a form of insight.
At the Menlo Park Veterans Hospital near San Francisco, the CIA financed a study named MK Ultra on the effects of psychoactive drugs. Among the guinea pigs was a promising young writer, Ken Kesey. Out of his experience came a 1962 bestseller, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Kesey became a celebrity. While LSD was still legal, he formed the Merry Pranksters, a freewheeling group of beats and hippies who held parties where guests could experiment with the drug. Entertaining the guests was a band of young musicians called the Warlocks, soon to become better known as the Grateful Dead.
We started taking LSD every Saturday night with the Kesey crew and having these big parties that were called the acid tests. And the idea was just to see where it was going to take us. And we started discovering stuff, you know, I guess psychic links or splices, we used to call them. I think in more classical terms, I think it was active Gestalt linkage, basic telepathy. And what we discovered is that this stuff is happening all the time. It's just that it gets a little faster and more furious when you remove the barriers that you erect as a child.
With the advent of acid, we discovered a new way to think. And it had to do with piecing together new thoughts in your mind that produced people like Bob Dylan and John Lennon and William S. Burroughs, that were using new images together in a way that jarred the mind and produced images that were latent in our consciousness, but were not being brought about by reading Vanity Fair or Woman's Home Companion.
The morning after the ayahuasca, or the yahe ceremony, you can only be astonished by how brilliantly the Kofan manipulate these plants to explore states of mind most people will never experience.
You know, the Amazon's an amazing, but it's a formidable place, and you never really sense its power until you're completely exposed to it. And it makes so much sense to me that yahe is this sort of plant that results in this cascade of emotions and of power and this serpentine sense of this other series of realms that just cascade over your imagination and really surround you and almost drown you with the intensity. And I've often joked that, you know, people who say they love the Amazon either haven't been here or they're liars. And the amazing thing about Schultes is that he really was a guy who liked the Amazon. He lived for it. And he came to understand every aspect of it, not only the plants, but the lifeways of the people, the way of the animals. And he became, in a sense, a child of this forest.
Even a child of the forest can be abandoned by its mother. On a journey up Brazil's Rio Negro in 1947, Schultes' luck finally ran out. He noticed a tingling sensation in his fingertips. Perhaps, he thought, it was the formaldehyde used to preserve his specimens. But after a few days, it had moved to his toes. It was beriberi, a dreaded tropical disease caused by a vitamin deficiency. 1,000 miles from the nearest city, with no more than a few cans of beans in his pack, Schultes now risked total paralysis and death. His only chance for survival, a huge dose of thiamine, vitamin B12, and Schultes was a very long way from a pharmacy. Racked with beriberi, plant explorer Richard Evans Schultes found himself in the most dangerous situation of his life. He was beginning to lose feeling in his extremities and was doomed unless he got the medication he needed, located hundreds of miles away in the city of Manaus. He headed for the nearest outpost, where a missionary suggested a shortcut to a military airfield for a quick flight out. The shortcut turned into a grueling month. Schultes' feet grew completely numb. He could walk only with the aid of 2 sticks. He encountered a group of nomadic Indians who invited him to join them in a hallucinogenic ceremony. The next morning, his mind still reeling with visions, Schultes searched for the sacred plant. On the brink of death, he had discovered not only a new species, but a new hallucinogen that had never before been reported by science. But his ordeal had just begun. He had no food. In treacherous rapids, his canoe capsized, dumping all of his remaining supplies and specimens into the river. When he reached the military outpost, he discovered that there were no planes. He turned around and headed back downriver. After a month of travel, he finally reached the port of Manaus. There he got his life-saving thiamine injections. And he rested for only 3 days before heading back into the jungle. 20 years later, the quiet world of discovery that Schultes enjoyed in the Amazon had exploded with a global embrace and celebration of psychedelics.
My sense is that there are really no good or bad drugs, that all drugs have the potential for constructive use and destructive use. And a challenge for human beings is when you find these powerful substances in nature, you have to find ways of using them to contain their destructive potential.
By the 1967 Summer of Love, globe-trotting botanist Richard Evans Schultes was a tenured professor at Harvard. students discovered his obscure papers on the hallucinogen ololeuki and set off a rush on morning glory seeds. They lined up outside his office for a glimpse of the psychedelic pioneer.
Marijuana is the most variable.
The psychedelic era was the unwanted child of Schultes. You know, he never thought of himself as an advocate of recreational drug use. In fact, he was always publicly against it. He was one of that cadre, one of that generation of scholars and seekers whose interpretation of the use of these magic plants was unfiltered by this kind of the miasma of the 60s. You know, these were these remarkable individuals, Huxley, Gordon Wasson, Albert Hofmann, Schultes, Wesson LaBarre, who were simply drawn to the inherent interest they had in these remarkable and curious plants.
In the 60s, hundreds of outsiders overran the quiet Mexican village where Schultes and Wasson had searched for the magic mushrooms. The curandera, Maria Sabina, became a reluctant celebrity. She disapproved of her idolizers, who brought other drugs to Huautla and sometimes used the mushrooms in frivolous ways. Stories began emerging about bad LSD trips, people jumping off rooftops thinking they could fly. By 1967, LSD was illegal, and Timothy Leary was soon to be a fugitive.
One shouldn't underestimate the potential dangers of these kind of drugs, particularly if one is not prepared to take them, if it's not being supervised properly. But on the other hand, I think there was also a journalistic exaggeration of the dangers of these drugs. There were things that were said about them that are blatantly untrue, such as that LSD causes chromosome damage. The Army documents state very clearly, LSD causes less chromosome damage than caffeine. That's a direct quote from these documents.
When the psychedelic movement started to emerge in the 1960s, a very conservative America blamed on psychedelics the environmental movement, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement. And so easy to blame it on a substance. If all we just do is stamp it out, we'll be healthy.
LSD, killer drug! LSD, killer drug! LSD, killer drug! LSD, killer drug!
The psychedelics are lumped with marijuana and heroin and cocaine in the category of bad drugs. And then there are the drugs we promote, alcohol and tobacco and various forms of caffeine and medically used uppers and downers. And, you know, we don't even see often that they're drugs. And the irony is that that category often has much more dangerous physical effects, much higher potential for addiction.
You know, with psychedelic work, there's
At leading American universities, researchers are reconsidering hallucinogens to treat mental disorders, alcoholism, and to aid the dying.
I do think that these plants and the chemicals in them have a potential to show people possibilities that are more optimistic and freeing than, you know, we see in our ordinary reality. And, you know, maybe it's no coincidence they appeared at this phase in human evolution when civilization seems to be in such crisis and heading so rapidly toward destruction.
In 2006, the discoverer of LSD celebrated his 100th birthday. Colleagues from all over the world came to Switzerland to honor Albert Hofmann, another reluctant father of the psychedelic era, who called LSD my problem child. Schultes never understood the hippie era. When William Burroughs described his Yahe trip as earth-shattering, Schultes replied, "That's funny, Bill. All I saw were colors." Schultes passed away in 2001 at the age of 86. Today, he is celebrated as the greatest Amazonian plant explorer of the 20th century. He described the medicinal use of 2,000 plants previously unknown to science. 120 species bear his name, including a plant for treating ulcers and another for curing conjunctivitis. A cockroach is named for Schultes. So is a mountain, and 2.2 million acres of protected rainforest. Before the world knew the word rainforest, Schultes warned it was vanishing, and worse. The Indian people and their knowledge, he wrote, are disappearing even faster than the plants themselves. A Brazilian botanist estimates that less than 1% of the Amazon's plants have been studied for their medical potential.
You know, I don't know if the world will ever see the likes of Richard Evans Schultes again. A man of such dedication, able to spend and wanting to spend years in the forest. But I do know that the example of his work, the inspiration of his spirit, will live on to fire the imagination of countless hundreds of scholars and seekers who will never forget his legacy.